Hey guys, welcome back to the Powerlifters Programming Podcast. We got Mike Tuchscherer on today. So very extremely requested guest, actually. This is probably maybe the most requests I had. I actually put a Q&A box up in my story the other day. I was like, who do you guys want on? And like legitimately half of them were you. So very happy. But with that being said, let's get into the first question. So this one is kind of more abstract question than I normally ask on the podcast, but I think you're a person that seems like you think about a lot of this stuff. So I'd like to start with this one. So it kind of like frames the rest of the questions, if that makes sense. So basically, in powerlifting, a lot of coaches use very different styles of programming. And I mean, we've seen success with everything. So it can be really hard to say if one style is perfect. We got like super low intensities, like a Shako, which seems to go really well. Really high intensities, like French lifters, also goes well. And then we can see the same thing with volumes and variations and frequencies, just about every variable. So I really wanted to ask, how much do you think the specifics of the program work versus how much a coach is kind of adjusting them in accordance to one another? So for example, like a Shako program is maybe using a little more frequency and more sets to make up for the fact that it's very submax, and other programs that are higher intensity and lower are probably lower volume and lower frequency to make up for it. So I know that's kind of a broad question, but if you put in any thought into this, this specifics play versus how a coach undulates them.
Yeah, I mean, this cuts immediately to like the core of like how I've thought about training from the beginning. Like I have been obsessed with powerlifting programming since I was a kid, really. And to me, it's just what you're describing, like I would look around and see, man, these guys got really strong doing West Side. These guys got really strong doing a Shako program. And like, how do you square this, And the thing that I've noticed is that it's not that the program doesn't matter, because it absolutely does matter. And anybody who's done a bad program can attest to that. And it's not even fair to call it a bad program, because someone else will do that exact same program and it'll be great. So it's not the program, it's this matchup between program and lifter, and that's been a through line that I've seen through my career. It's like, you've got to get the right program, but it's got to be the right program for that lifter. And there absolutely are better and worse ways to configure these. Like you mentioned, like if you're going to turn the frequency up, then you probably need to see, I don't even want to say like turn the volume, like it needs to be volume oriented, because then you've got Bulgarian style programs that have high frequency and high intensity. But there is like this balance point between stress and recovery, right? So like you have to balance these things. And I don't want to focus too much on stress and recovery, because there's principles all over the place that have to be balanced in order to get like a valid program, a program that could conceivably work for someone, and then it's a different question of it's the best program for you. This was forgive me for rambling on about this, but like I teach emerging strategies, and it's very like empirically driven. Like you try a development block and you monitor your results, and we say all the time, lean and like follow the trail of athlete response. You lean into that. And when I first started teaching it, I thought you could pretty much just do that. Like if you experiment and you are trying different ideas, you keep the best ones, then you'll converge on the ideal program. And in theory, that should work. But one thing that I've learned is that there are a lot of bad ideas. There are a lot of programs that likely won't work for pretty much anybody. I mean, it's hard to say never, right? But there are programs that I look at and I go, I would not give that to anybody that I could think of, but if you kind of cover some of those bases, then you come back to this idea of like, well, coaches see this all the time, right? Like somebody works with a coach who has a particular style. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. They go to work with a different coach with a different style, And athletes a lot of times will find a coach that kind of is the combination of things that they need. But my philosophy as a coach has been like, how can I work with any athlete that comes to me? Like an athlete comes to me and they say, I want you to coach me. How can I, be competent to give them the program that they need?
So
avoid monologuing quite that much. But
no, it's great. I think the more you explain, the more people like it, honestly. I like it. So with that being said, I guess if you have like a certain amount of athletes, how widely are the prescriptions varying? Because obviously they're going to vary a ton. If you have a very lightweight woman, she's probably going to have more frequency versus a heavyweight man. But just like outside of, I guess it is individual difference, but outside of like the common individual difference, are you kind of going from like, we have this model and we use similar RPEs, and we'd use, I guess RPEs would be the biggest one to focus on because a lot of the volume would just vary on other individual responses. But so like RPE wise, is that a thing that in your system you're like top down, we kind of like doing RP8s for this and RP6s here, and then you build the volume and the frequency around that? Or is that something you're also going to vary a lot athlete to athlete?
I will vary it hopefully as much as I need to. Every coach has tendencies though, and I mean, I have my tendencies, my kind of favorite strategies that, in the absence of some sort of clear nudge in one direction or another, it pulls me some which way. I think I have a reputation for using quite a bit of variations in my programs, probably higher RPEs than a lot of people see in, I guess, more contemporary programming. But that's definitely just a bias, I guess. That's where I'll go if I have nothing else nudging me. And lately, especially, I've been a lot more proactive about finding those nudges. Like, I don't want to rest on whatever that bias is. So lately, we've been doing more velocity testing and just different diagnostics to try to see if we can gain some insight on, should you be training at lower RPEs? Should you be training at higher RPEs? Or can we get a good estimate, before just doing tons of experiments? And this is one place where experienced lifters have an advantage, I think, because they have tried lots of these things, and they can come to me and say, hey, I tend to respond really well to low RPEs. Okay, well, we'll start there and start our experimentation there, and we can branch out as time goes on, or, if we find that it's really working, then we'll just stay there, but I think it's important to kind of find those biases, and you're going to have them. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have biases and tendencies, just to be aware of them and decide, is that something that you want, or is it serving you or not? Like, in my opinion, like my tendency toward higher RPE stuff felt like it was not serving me as well, and I wanted a bit more clarity. So that's kind of where the impulse to do more diagnostic testing has come from. And so far so good. It's not quite thorough enough to where I can, put my stamp on it and say, yeah, this is definitely the thing. But we've been doing it, and it nudges me in directions that I wouldn't have otherwise thought to go, even in my own training. So like I'm doing a block right now with pretty high rep, low RPE benching, and so far it's going pretty well. I mean, we'll see if it is meaningful over the course of a development block or a couple development blocks, but I wouldn't have thought to try that, outside of getting some of these nudges.
Yeah, I actually, with my bench, been doing something similar. I came from like a very like, let's train bodybuilder style because it's very fun, lots of like AMRAPs on bench, that kind of thing. And then recently I was like, let's just like change it up to the polar opposite, because now that sounds fun. I've been doing this for a few years, and I swapped over to like much more frequent, more sets, but pretty sub max. Like all my sets were like RB 5 to 6. And
Mhm.
same thing, just continue to make progress. And it just puts in perspective. It's like, wow, like we put so much attention into this stuff. And I think it's important because even if one of those is microscopically better when you're coaching
Right.
people, that's important. But at the same time, it just makes you question, like, well, I think we also put too much like our bias, basically. If you have a bias, this one's absolutely better. It's like, well, probably only like half the time, even if it is, to be honest.
Yeah, and I mean it can be better for now. That's the other component here is that I think you're going to adapt to a thing, and it makes sense that once you've kind of removed a certain bottleneck, you'll have a different bottleneck, and you'll need to train that in a slightly different way. And I don't want to gloss over another thing that you said, which is kind of the attention and effort component of it. And I think people get this wrong a little bit, where they kind of wash away the differences in the programming and just say like, just train hard. As long as you're putting the effort in, it kind of doesn't matter. And I don't think that's true. First of all, I think the details do matter. And I think the details matter to your effort as well. Like, it's not just like you can stick somebody on a 5x5 and just have them do that for 15 years and never change something, and expect the same level of effort at the end of that you do in the beginning, unless you're Tony Cliff. But like, there's always exceptions, right? Like, I couldn't do that, but you know, Tony Cliff is the example that comes to mind there, but of a guy. I mean, there are a few other people who will have kind of their program and they really hammer it for a long, long period of time. And I think a lot of that's personality driven. And that stuff kind of gets hand waved a little bit as being like woo woo stuff or not that important, or like, why don't you just squash that stupid personality bullshit and like just train the right way, like, well, come on, like that's not realistic. You've got to, the training, I'm a hardcore proponent of, like, the training has to fit the lifter. It can't work the other way around, not for any sustainable amount of time.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and if you want someone to get to the highest level of powerlifting, they can't run a program for 6 months and then quit. So at the end of the day, like
Right.
it's maybe the most important thing is just adherence. But yeah, I totally agree. Like, kind of the way I view it is like, have you heard? I'm sure you've heard of the golden microcycle, right?
Right.
Like, you might have something that's a microcycle and it looks absolutely perfect and it's working amazing. So the details of it are like ridiculously important. You could change 20 different things to finally get there, and you're like, all right, this is just working so well for this period of time. But you could probably also have like 30 different iterations of it, where like on this day you change the set of 5 to this set scheme, or you change this RPE and swap out this instead, And it's like, so the
Right.
details are super important, but there's a lot of different golden microcycles that you could have. You just only kind of see the one. I'm sure one is truly the best, but there's just no way to know, unfortunately.
Right. Hold on one second. Sorry.
No worries.
There we go.
You did mention the higher, like, the inclination to a higher RPE and more variations than average. Can you explain why you think you have an inclination to the higher RPE? We can start with that one.
Yeah, it has to do, I think, with the way that I came up in the sport. It was just, that's how everybody trained. So like, that's my background. It's like, if you grow up speaking English, then you later on you learn Spanish, you probably still think in English, or like you maybe learn Spanish really well, but then when you're stressed or something like that, like you kind of default to, your native language, like your first language, you know. I think maybe it's something similar to that, it, like, that's just kind of how I came up and where some of my biases are. That's training that, it's also training that worked for me, which I think influences a lot of coaches. It's important to acknowledge that too. Like, it's fine to have things that work for you, or that worked for you in an athletic sense or a coaching sense, biases and things like that. That's all great, but it's what you do with it. Do you just let it be? Do you ignore it, or do you work work to find the edge cases and limitations there as well? It's something I do make a lot of effort on. And you have clients where it's not that they're blank slates, but they kind of show up without a lot of uh, history that you can rely on or that you can make good inference from. So you got to start somewhere. And I mean, what's worked for you in the past, as a coach especially, seems like a good place to start. So I think that's a lot of it, for me personally. And then, like, there's other reasons and rationale, like how certain things have stayed despite that, kind of origination. Like the variations has been one. I still use lots of variations, and I think that it's because it's been a way to work through problems, and it's been a way to keep training sustainable for a long period of time. And we'll absolutely have strategies that go away from that for a period of time, maybe a high frequency strategy. Absolutely, I will run stuff like that. But I find that it does, at least the people that I work with, it does kind of grind them down a little bit. So it's good to get away from it sometimes. And that's what, like, I don't know, I've learned recently that what people mean when they say golden micro depends on who you're talking to. But what I hear a lot of times, it has to do with like a weekly schedule, and like finding this weekly schedule that vibes with a person. Like, well, we do our primary squat on this day, and then we do a secondary squat and a tertiary squat or whatever on these days, and it lines up just so. But I think about that sometimes. Well, what happens if we are doing a block where we're only doing one squat movement a week and tons of accessories, or 2 squat movements a week, or 4 squat movements a week? Like, that would have to change the weekly schedule. So, and this could be semantic arguments. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree, but it does seem like we've got to talk about changing the weekly schedule in light of these changing variables. And if you're going to change the weekly schedule, it doesn't seem so golden anymore. And that's fine. Like, I have tons of scheduling options that I like to keep, and I think it's a good idea to change your weekly schedule around. Maybe not every block, but from time to time. I think it's just one of these, another variable that you can kind of get accommodated to, and that you just kind of go on autopilot for it sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. It's like you could currently be running something that you think is the golden microcycle because you're making really good progress, and why would you change it? If you have an athlete that's making great progress, like, coaches, don't change it, you'll probably just make it go worse. But like, you could actually be running like the silver microcycle. So it's like this weird thing as a coach where, like, is this perfect? But they're making good progress. Like, I don't want to change it. But like, I think a lot of coaches are very like perfectionist, and so they have that inclination to always wonder, even if they shouldn't be tinkering with it.
Yeah,
mentioned
I can
though.
relate to that.
Yeah, I say that to athletes all the time. Like, yo, you're making good progress right now, but like, I'm just gonna wait until it slows down because I want to try this out, but I really shouldn't be.
Well, like, I have another bias toward variation too. Like, my tendency is to want to change things from block to block, and at this point, I think, well, I'm sure that I do get a decent amount of selection bias in the people that I work with, so that works more often than not. But I do work with people sometimes that don't like that, and that's fine too. Like, that's just something, okay, this person doesn't like as much change from one block to the next, so I got to, bring it in a little bit, keep it a little bit tighter from one block. But that's okay.
Yeah, I've heard, I think it was like Jason Tremblay. I think I heard him say it, and he was talking about, like, and maybe he got it from Ben Escrow, so it kind of goes all the way back. But he was saying basically the way he views variations, maybe he does it a little differently now. I know like Taylor's using more variations, whatnot, was like if you're doing a squat, even compared to a similar variation like a pause squat, if you add 100 kilos to your squat, you know for a fact your squat went up 100 kilos. But if you add 100 kilos to your pause squat, maybe it only went up 99, you know? And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And I'm not trying to like speak for Jason, because I'm sure if he was here, he'd be saying different nuances and whatnot. So sorry, Jason. But I also think there's obviously reasons that you do more variations. And so could you kind of touch on like if that's more so for like recovery or like injury prevention, just novelty? I'm sure it's a mixture, because like I don't necessarily think that the example I gave is perfect, because obviously if someone has a technique issue that's fixed by a pause squat, maybe adding a certain amount actually benefits the competition lift even more than 100 kilos.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where I go with a lot of the variations is this desire to just have different stimuli. You know, I don't need to monitor the progress of the squat multiple times per week. I mean, even once a week is of dubious benefit, but we like it, so that's how it goes, you know. But the volume of squat work that you do, like, hold on, let me back up for a second. I like to use the Bondarchuk classification system when it comes to exercise selection. So let me just go through that briefly. There's 4 classifications. We'll talk about 3 of them. There's the competition exercise, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's the lift as you do it in competition. So think about, we'll talk about squats. We're squatting with knee sleeves and a belt for classic squatters, right? On a straight bar to depth, you know, no pauses and things like that. Then you have your developmental exercises. These are exercises that where you start with the competition lift and maybe you tweak 1 or 2 small variables to emphasize something. You know, often developmental exercises focus on some sort of technical development, but it's still essentially the same movement pattern. So lots of the same muscles are involved, similar energy systems are involved and things like that, just a couple small tweaks. So some examples here might be a SSB squat or a high bar squat, or this is where you'll see pause squats and pin squats and things like that. Then you have the next level is preparatory exercises. This is where you, I guess this is where most people classify like accessory work. These are similar muscles involved, related energy systems, different movements. So think about like split squats. It's not the same movement pattern as a competition squat. Leg press, belt squat even I would put in this category, because it's, you know, similar movement, but not everything's being loaded the same way. Leg extensions, all that stuff is going to fall in the preparatory exercise bucket. So for me, kind of my default is to make sure that I've got an exposure for each of these categories in a given week. And that, especially for the squat, that tends to be a good starting point for most people in most work capacities. So we've got a competition exercise exposure, developmental exercise, and a preparatory exercise exposure. And then you can mix and match from there. And there's an infinite number of ways that you can slice this up to get different frequencies. Oh, I like my accessories every day. Oh, that's fine. You can do all these things, you know, but having something present from each of the categories is a Bondarchuk idea. And I think that's generally a good starting point. Again, strategies are multitude, but to me, the developmental exercises are what we're talking about here. And often it's to address some sort of movement deficiency. Like we're learning technique while we're also building strength. You know, say that you have a lifter with a chest fall pattern, you know, good morning squat, whatever you want to call it, right? And you as a coach are saying, it would be better if we could reduce that. You know, I want to reduce our tendency to kind of have this breakdown. It's load dependent, meaning like their opener, they don't have this pattern as much as they do on their second and third attempt, right? So there's a few different ways you can approach it. You can train the competition exercise, in which case you need to do certain things in order to train that mechanic. This is a whole rabbit hole we can go down. But again, the details that you're trying to correct are going to matter here. I think that if in the scenario that I'm setting up, kind of setting this up as we're talking as well, so hopefully it works out. But we're talking about like maybe you've got this lifter who shows this good morning squat pattern a little bit on the second attempt, a lot on the third attempt, and you're trying to work through this, right? Well, second and third attempts tend to be pretty high RPE, maybe 9 and 10 RPE. So chances are, if you're at 7, 6 RPE, you're not seeing this pattern. And from a neuromechanical standpoint, if they're not challenging that pattern, I think the carryover it's not nothing, but it's minimal. You're grooving the correct pattern at 6 and 7 RPE, but you're not really challenging the mechanic. That only comes at higher RPEs. So now you got to ask yourself, do I want to train the competition exercise at 9 and 10 RPE? Probably not most of the time. I think most coaches are comfortable with that. Like, I don't want to have them do competition squats week in and week out at 10 RPE so we can work on this mechanic, right? So you're grooving the correct movement pattern with the competition exercise. That's great. But then how do you develop the weak mechanical pattern and develop any sort of underdeveloped musculature or anything like that? I think that's where developmental exercises are really handy. So in this case, again, maybe I'll use SSB squat, or maybe a pause squat, maybe a pin squat. All these tend to work that same mechanic. They put a lot of emphasis on this coordination between shoulders and hips as you come out of the hole. You can train them at a little bit higher RPE. Also, due to the nature of the lift, it's probably going to show up a little bit sooner because those exercises challenge that mechanic a little bit more than the competition exercise does. So it's not showing up at 9 and 10 RPE, now it's showing up at 7 and 8 RPE. So you can train your SSB squats at 7 RPE or 8 RPE, and it's a little easier to tolerate, it's a little easier to recover from. And like it's easier to recover from for its own sake because it's not the competition exercise. And you also don't get all the sports psych stuff get wrapped up in that, where lifters have bits of their ego wrapped up in training the competition lifts. That's just how it is. You can tell them this is a secondary session, tertiary session, or whatever, and that helps, but it doesn't eliminate the issue. You have a lot less ego wrapped up in your SSB squat numbers, right? So we're able to kind of stick to the protocol a little bit better. We're able to train the mechanic that we want a little bit better. We're able to recover from it a little bit better. So I think there's lots of wins to go around there.
I'm completely serious. I think you just convinced me to use more variations. I've listened to like a ridiculous amount of powerlifting content, and so like usually when people come on, I have a pretty good idea of what they're going to say about things.
Yeah.
But you said that, and you just like framed it in a way with the RPEs in a way that I just genuinely have never thought of before. I'm like, that makes total sense. Athletes, all your programs are changing this week. Y'all get tons of it. No, but yeah, that's really interesting. That's super interesting.
That's awesome.
How much are you using variations as like a fatigue management strategy, both from like, say like joints, like this person does squats in this certain way and it always hurts their knees, so maybe do like tempo squats and then they're healthy, or how much are you using it in a fatigue management of just like this person is like in a pivot block, you're changing just to like there's some sort of like, I don't know, I call it like specific fatigue, like movement specific fatigue, that if you notice like you do a pivot block that just kind of goes away after a week or two.
Sure. Like for a pivot, I do a lot more just change for change's sake. but that's for a different reason. We're not, the intent of a pivot is not sports skill development. It's just, you think of it like a pseudo deload almost. So it's exactly what you're saying. Let's take some pressure off of the joints and the musculature, but also sports, like the athlete's psychology, where you can just go in and, okay, well, I'm doing wide stance SSB squats today, like whoop-de-doo, like, like if I'm using like 50 kilos less than, they don't get their ego wrapped up in that, which is, I think, an important part of this as well. So I think including variation in the pivots has even stronger rationale. In the development block, I'm not usually thinking of it as a load management strategy. So there, I think it is a little bit easier to recover from, but it's on the margins. So to stay with the example of the squatter we were talking about before, where they have their primary squat, and then maybe the secondary day is a SSB squat or something. The SSB squat is going to put, first of all, the weight on the bar is going to be a little bit lighter. It's going to put more stress on the erectors, because the bar is generally trying to roll you up, and so there's a lot more work being done by the erectors to maintain position. Because of that, there's a little bit less done by your quads and adductors and things like that, right? How much less? I mean, we can guess, and we can, which I love that stuff. Like, we can get our spreadsheets out, and I think that's fun. But it's a little bit, and that's usually not the driving force behind it unless I'm working around an injury. So, like in my case, I think I tend to be a good example of this one. I hurt my back, in really back in like 2014, and it took me like 2 years to notice to the point where I was willing to do anything about it. But that's when I got really into front squats. And then coming back from that, I noticed that if I did too much like forward lean movements, like back squats or deadlifts, that it would start to get irritated again. So front squats became a great way for me to train lower body, but avoid that forward lean position that was like a difficult position for my back to be in. So it is kind of like a very detailed load management approach. And we've done that with other people and other things too. Like, I've had lifters with neck injuries who need to be careful, like how much are they arching in the week? So we'll monitor that and kind of use movement variations to get around specific tissue load tolerances. And I think lots of coaches will do this with like back musculature. That's why we will belt squat or leg press, and instead of do another round of high bar squats, it's individual tissue tolerances, which is great. There's like the bigger instances of that, which is like the belt squat. Obviously, you're not taxing the erectors and things like that at all, but then there's like the more detailed versions of it where, maybe you do, like the SSB is a good example of, we're just going to shift that training stress a little bit in one direction or another. Bench has tons of them. There's just more variations for the bench. Close grip takes a little bit of pressure off the pecs. In a lot of cases, it depends on your comp grip and things like that. But it always depends on tons of things, which is part of why we have these talks, right? But yeah, like if you move your grip in close enough, then you're taking some pressure off the pecs. So like if you've got a lifter who, their tissue specific work capacity of the pecs or the delts or something can only tolerate so much comp benching in a week, then yeah, that you can use variations that way. I don't tend to think of it that way a lot. I guess you can as part of like a problem solving strategy, but that's usually not my default.
Yeah, that all makes total sense. Funny story actually. When I was maybe like 17, I like saw one of your videos on like pivot blocks. I was like, oh sweet, I'm gonna try this out. And at the time, I just like had no idea what I was doing at all, and I would just do like ridiculous amounts of volume. I was just way overreached. So I do like 30 sets of deadlift a week, and like my deadlift naturally is down by like I was like a 500 puller, but I was like struggling with 405, you know. And so I'd change up my variation of like, all right, we're gonna do like a beltless, like conventional block pull and all this stuff. And I do it for a couple weeks. And then I'd come back to my comp lift and I'd have like 3 workouts where I could like hit an effective sumo. And I'm like, all right, I'm like the 3rd workout. We're going for the sumo PR because I'm going to be destroyed after that. And like my body would be hurting. And then like I'd hit like a 5-pound PR and then my numbers would just absolutely tank again. I'd have to like run through the variations. So, I mean, to some extent, the pivot blocks almost worked too well for me when I was younger, where I could get away with just like horrendous training and had no idea how to manage fatigue, but just kind of got away with it. So shout out to you, I guess. That
Yes, I mean, the pivots are interesting, man, because like there's so many ways to do it, and I don't talk about it enough probably because since there are so many ways to do it and so many ways to solve, like the pivot's doing a lot of work in a program, and like I was talking about valid strategies earlier, there's way more valid pivot strategies than there are dev block strategies, and I just tend not to talk about it because we're powerlifters and we would rather spend our time talking about like getting strong and getting better at the sport, you know, but there's a lot of things you can do with a pivot. Not all of them you should do, but you can, right? And I mean, that's another thing that can work in a lot of different ways for different people. Some people need more training stress, more specificity. Other people need more variation. Some people need more energy system work or more strength maintenance work. Like there's tons of different ways to slice a pivot, but because it's not chasing after sport development, it's just a little less interesting to talk about. So it gets pushed aside. It's also more difficult to see if it's working. Like you can do a dev block and then at the end you're like, yes, I got stronger, or no, I didn't. But a pivot is difficult because how do you measure the success of that pivot? Well, you kind of have to infer that success based on how the next dev block goes. And now we've got a bunch of different things swirling around, kind of conflicting with each other and clouding your overall view of things. And yeah, but that's just training, you know, like the idea of, well, I'm just going to change one variable at a time so I can see what's making the difference. That's just not realistic. That's not how real human beings work. And so I just don't worry myself with it. There's to some extent you will have to just cope with the complexity and look at things and use your judgment to say, yeah, it looks like this is associated with good results, even though I can't, you know, prove it scientifically. You know, that's your job as a coach is not to prove it scientifically, though. Like, let's leave that to the scientist.
No, yeah, I totally agree. Especially with some of the variation stuff that I do with the pivots, like I almost couldn't make sense of some of it. I'm like, this just like routinely works really well. And sometimes I drop the ball for sure as my 17-year-old self, but I could get things to work. But like I almost just couldn't explain it. Like at certain points, it was, I'm still super fatigued, but I come back to the comp lift and I can make it go well for like a very short period of time, even though like my body's killing me. I don't know if it was like the way I rationalized it. I don't know if you'll agree with this at all. Is I was like, I had to stay away from the comp lift a certain period of time. So when I come back, I was a little bit rusty, and it was like I lost some neurological adaptations. And so potentially like the next 2 workouts, I was like regaining the neurological adaptations, which maybe like outpaced some of the fatigue I had. I don't know. That's what my 17-year-old self was thinking. I genuinely couldn't explain it, but like you said, I guess maybe it doesn't matter if I can explain it as long as it routinely works.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too far in that direction because like being able to explain stuff definitely helps make future predictions more accurate.
Cool.
Like you are in the prediction business as a coach, like
Yeah.
you write a program which is basically saying that's your prediction. If you do this, then that will be better than doing something else. So being able to explain things and like having good rationale is important, but we've seen plenty of people do the right thing for the wrong reasons, and it's still the right thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's not the best solution, but it's still the right thing, and that's still something to be learned in those situations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we've all had someone like some local guy at a gym or something. It's like
Yeah,
really strong. And you ask him about something like his training clearly works. So like, I guess you can't knock
right,
it too much, but his explanation, you're like, that kind of makes no sense, but like it's working. So maybe I'll give it a shot.
right. Like that is not how the body works. But so, like, I don't know. I probably get caught up in apologetics for the old systems in this way as well, because like I'll see stuff like that and think that, like, okay, this clearly worked because those dudes were effing strong,
Mhm.
but the reasoning doesn't make any sense. So what was going on there? Can I understand uh, the reasoning? Does that teach me something to like look for that reasoning, with a uh, more updated lens, I guess you would say. And I don't know, sometimes I think it helps, sometimes maybe less so, but I do continue to come back to a lot of those systems and um, find interesting wrinkles that I didn't see before, and I've been doing this for, more than 20 years now.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's tough to tell because there are so many moving variables. Like you've said, like sometimes
Yeah,
someone could say, I started doing back work and like that same block, my bench went up by like 15 kilos. It was crazy. And then you find out like they replaced like an accessory slot with back work and they were just like super overreached. And it's like maybe the back work helped some, but like it's probably because you removed the pec work and now you're actually like recovering decently and you basically just like peaked this block, there's so
right.
many
Yeah.
variables. But you mentioned the scientific thing, and I did want to ask you about that a little more. Is there
Yeah.
anything that comes to mind that, like the current meta in science, like you'd say, I disagree with that. I think um, I've noticed this works better instead, or anything just with individuals that you say, yeah, typically these RPEs tend to work scientifically, but I find like I have 10 athletes and they're just kind of the opposite. They respond in a different way.
I don't, nothing like immediately comes to mind as being like, yeah, I think they missed the mark on that, because I think fundamentally they're answering a little different question than what I am. And it would be easy to explain away differences in observations as just individual differences again. So like maybe RPE is a good place to start. Uh, the paradigm of having lower RPEs and really low velocity loss for the purposes of strength building, you know, I think is that better for most people? I mean, maybe, I don't know. That's not really my business, like that's not the problem that I'm spending all my time trying to solve, like what's better for most people. What I'm observing is like what's better for these people that I work with, which tend to be very, very trained powerlifters. They're it's rare that I'm working with people with less than 6 or 7 years of experience, I would say, which is a lot of experience as a competitive powerlifter, and that's going to color my view on like what works for most people uh, quite a bit, But so one of the ways that I try to deal with that is keep an open dialogue with other coaches, and like other RTS coaches as well are a great hedge for this, because we speak the same language, but they work with different groups of people than I do, and lots of the people that they work with will be, just different populations, whether it's geographic or age difference, demographic, whatever, weight classes and different things. And it's good to compare notes and see like, okay, there's something here, you're seeing, low RPEs. I'm not seeing low RPEs as much. So what's going on? Like, what's the difference? And see if we can figure out, because like I was thinking about this today. I think what I'm trying to get to is some kind of programming bedrock, like something like a first principle, because you would think that at some level, like we're all humans adapting in similar ways. And if you get to whatever this thing is, the rest of it kind of emerges from that. You get emergent properties basically maybe based around your personality or your schedule or all these different things, strengths and weaknesses, injury history, sports background, leverages, and muscle attachment points, and fast twitch, slow twitch ratios, all these things. They have an impact. And maybe, like, I don't think that there's just something special about you deep in your soul that makes you respond to high intensity training. And since I'm a special snowflake in my soul too, I respond to high volume training. I think there's some difference. And if we could figure out what that difference is, then we can get to the optimization part a lot faster. So anyway, that kind of a tangent to say, like, there are differences, and that's kind of where my attention has been going more. I mean, it's been going there for for a long time, but it continues to go in that direction.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. Like, on one hand, I think looking at science is really important to like get an idea of what maybe we could try out or like where to start. But then at a certain point, like if you're coaching Jesus, like probably no study on the planet can really tell you anything about what his training should look like. And the best thing is like Joey was working on, he's like, all right, you squat 800. How do we get to 800? And then let's like make a little tweak. Now we're at 900. And like Jesus is just like the n=1 because no one's ever done what he's doing. So I don't think we can really look at other people too much that are squatting 2 plates to infer much. And then also with that last part you were saying, I totally agree with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I relate to that Jesus anecdote as well. Like, so I got to work with Dennis Cornelius back in like really when he was at his peak. And we had talked about working together for kind of a long time, and just never did. And then one day he said, all right, let's do it. And I remember feeling like the dog that caught the car a little bit, like, okay, now what, And I did almost the same thing as what you described. I'm like, okay, he's already like the strongest dude in the planet. Like, there's so many more ways that this could go wrong than there are for it to go right. Let's start very close to home base. He's got a thing that he's been doing, start there. And that was our initial block, was like, okay, here's the thing that you've been doing. Let me just translate that into RTS speak, and let's run that for a block and see how we do, and then we're going to make some small changes. So I was a lot more conservative coaching somebody like that. And I've been fortunate to get to coach several people in that kind of situation. And I think just starting a little more conservatively makes sense in those situations. But if coaching is a bet in some way on like future results, like just by taking that person on, you're betting that you can help them be even better. Otherwise, why would you take that on? Like, that's not going to work out well for you, right? Or them or anybody. So you have to have something to offer, So that's the thing, is like, okay, I have something to contribute. And it's just this balance between wanting to contribute that thing, but not changing things so quickly that we, knock this cart completely off the rails.
Yeah. Because someone at that level like clearly has like done some training that works well for them, and they clearly get a good response to training. But at the same time, that's very scary because you're like I'm on a pedestal. Everyone knows I'm training him right now. This could look really bad if he shows up.
Yeah, like
100 pounds down.
Yeah, they get hurt or something like that, and you go, oh man, wasn't good. I mean, look, that's happened to me before as well. You know, you do it long enough, it happens. I think it's important for coaches to protect their confidence because you're in a creative business, you know, especially if you're doing this competitively, you're doing this trying to help people push further in an athletic sense. If it was easy, they wouldn't really need much of your help, you know. It is a challenge, so you have to like bring this creative energy to it. And if you start beating yourself up or you lose some of your own confidence, then it gets a lot harder to bring that creative energy, to you feel like you have something to contribute, you know. So I think it's important to protect that confidence, and it can be hard to do, like if you are in a situation where, you know, sometimes things don't work out, and sometimes just it doesn't always go well, right? Like not every coaching collaboration goes well, and sometimes athletes, maybe somebody gets hurt or something like that. uh, it can affect your confidence as a coach, and if that causes you to lose some of that creative problem solving or lose some of your leadership ability, that's going to make it worse. So, I mean, the coaching mentality side, the coaching that is coaching performance is maybe something else to talk about. But I would say that that's important to pay attention to and do things that protect your confidence.
Yeah, that's something I've thought about because obviously I'm a much newer coach than you, and my average athlete is much newer and not nearly as strong as your average athlete. But I haven't really like hit it yet because I'm so new to the game. But I've kind of thought like at some point, like I'm inevitably going to have some athletes over the course of my career that like maybe I'm one block away from figuring it out, but they're like, sorry, I'm out of here. And they go with another coach and make progress. And even if I can be a great coach with the other 99 athletes that I work with, not that I have 100 athletes, but
Yeah, I hear.
yeah, like they might just have a weird atypical response to training that they start with my system and it just doesn't work right off the bat, and it would have taken me like 6 blocks to get things flowing to find their state versus they start working with you and your system, your like biases just work better off the bat with them, so
Right.
going with you. But I think that's just bound to happen no matter who you are as a coach.
Yeah. It for sure is, you know. And I mean, I've definitely had collaborations with people where I am happy to say, like, most people that have left, like, our collaboration, I don't know how to phrase this properly right now, but most people I've worked with that have left before I've run out of ideas. You know? Like, there's still things to try. You know, there have been, I think there's maybe one guy who, you know, bless him, and he stuck around, and we tried everything I could think of to get his lifts moving, and it just never did. And then eventually he did. Like, he didn't like leave the sport or anything, so he left and did some different training, and it started working for him, you know. And I'm like trying to figure this out. I'm like, man, what did you do differently, you know? And I don't know. I mean, I still haven't fully figured this out because like what he did, I'm thinking like, yeah, we tried that and nothing, you know. So whatever it was, there's more. I haven't fully figured out the puzzle yet, you know, and I think that's okay. There's still stuff to learn.
Yeah, definitely. I did want to ask, how much time do you have left? Because I don't want to take up too much of your time for a time crunch. I have a couple more questions.
No, I'm good.
Okay,
I'm good.
Great. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I feel like it's like two-handed. If I was in that perspective, like the evil side of me would be like, to protect my ego, I hope you don't make progress because then I'm just an idiot. But at the same time, I'd be like, I liked you as an athlete, so I really hope you make progress, and then I can like DM you and steal your coach's ideas and learn from it.
I mean, you can contain more than one feeling or more than one idea, right? And like, you have these different things swirling around, like everybody does. But you know, I hope that we aspire to be professionals, and you know, we keep the ego in check, even when it's barking at us from the subconscious or something.
Oh yeah, definitely. Let's see. I have a couple more questions here. Let's Okay, this is an interesting one. I don't think I've talked to anyone about this, but I think work capacity is pretty commonly talked about in powerlifting. And I definitely think it's a very real thing. But I think a lot of the times people sometimes like they'll make the mistake of like, I need to improve my work capacity because I'm trying to deadlift every day and I'm not getting stronger. And it's very clear, like, it might not be a work capacity issue. It's like you don't need to increase your recovery capacity to deadlift every day. You just need to not deadlift every day and then you'll be recovering. So, in your words, like, how do you know if it's a work capacity issue versus a like you're just doing too much work issue?
I mean, I think it's both of those things at the same time, that I think we can get kind of jumbled up sometimes on what work capacity is. So let's start there. To me, work capacity is your ability to do work and recover from it. So everyone has a work capacity, and it's either higher or lower. We can put a number on it. Like I use stress index because it works across different intensity zones. And you can kind of think of it like number of hard sets, but there's a lot more detail that goes into it than that. We'll leave that for a different conversation if you want. For now, let's think of it like number of hard sets. If I can recover from 10 sets per week and you can recover from 15 sets per week, I would say that's our relative work capacities. I'm at 10, you're at 15. Your work capacity is higher than mine. Now, maybe I'm still stronger, which at the end of the day, for powerlifters, that's the thing that you care about. The next question is, like, should you do something about your work capacity? Well, that's a different issue. If my work capacity is 10 and my program has programmed 12, then I'm going to have recovery issues. I will accumulate fatigue over the course of the program and it'll show up as recovery issues. Maybe not like really bad or something. It's not like a catastrophe, to be 2 SI off on, your program work capacity or something. But the idea is that you have this certain amount that you can recover from. Now, from there, it's up to the coach to figure out like what, again, you're making predictions and making bets on what you think is going to drive this athlete's progress forward. And we'll use a more extreme example just to see the point, and then we can, be more nuanced after that. When I first started getting back into training and competing in powerlifting after my injury, I had taken like a 6-year break. I'd still lifted, done a lot of front squats, but I hadn't deadlifted in particular for 6 years. And more than that, I'd done very little like posterior chain work because most things that train like hip extension, for example, also tend to load the spine. And that was a mechanic I had issues with. So the work capacity there was super, super low. So for a long time after coming back to competing, my deadlift work capacity was like 2 SI per week. So yeah, like 2 sets per week. Like once I would have a session where I did 1 work set of competition deadlifts, and then maybe later in the week, I would do like 1 set of single leg RDLs. And that was it. That was all I could really tolerate, And it was enough to move my deadlift forward from the place that it was, so I was making progress. Then as time goes on, that stops working and you start going, okay, what are my options? How do I solve this problem? Well, with a limit of 2 SI per week, there's just not a lot you can do. What are you going to do? You're going to add accessory work? You can't, your limit's 2 SI per week. So you've got to find some way to get that work capacity higher in order to have more options even available to you. Like we were talking about developmental exercises. I still haven't done much developmental exercises for the deadlift in like this second half of my career because work capacity is just too low, and it takes a long time to build it up, even with dedicated work. I don't think things like aerobic work and stuff like that are really the thing that builds work capacity, unless it's like absurdly low work capacity, then maybe it helps some. But in general, I think we're talking about more specific work that needs to be done, and it just needs time to develop.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I view it very similarly, especially in regards to injuries. I think like whenever I came from that quote unquote bodybuilder style training with like a lot of AMRAPs, immediate and like lower frequency, higher intensity, lower volume. Immediately whenever I jumped into like the higher frequency, everything, I was like, wow, I am insanely sore. Like I need to ease into this more. I'm going to injure myself. But then like it was a very quick work capacity increase. Where I was like, 2 weeks later, I'm good to go. Actually, I did injure myself. So I tore my hamstring like a month ago. But that was like that's like 6 months into doing this. And it was just like some poor circumstances. But I'm fine now for the most part. I'm easing back to the deadlift.
That's good.
But yeah, I think I view that very similarly. And then like over the long term, that's a tough thing to do, especially if you're like dealing with a back injury. You're like, I don't want to flare this up, so I need to very gradually do it. But also like at a certain point, you can only tolerate, like my hamstring right now can tolerate like essentially nothing. That's something that needs to go up. But you can't overdo it and re-injure your hamstring or your back. But like I can't progress my deadlift pulling 50% for a single once a week forever, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are some limits there, and you get some, it's hard to anticipate some of this stuff because there's like some weird like edge case loading limits that you'll run into. Again, like when I was injured, I spent like 6 years and basically not training posterior chain that much, outside of what you would get from front squatting, and like split squats and things like that, which tend to be like enough training for glutes, but probably almost nothing for hamstrings,
Mm-hmm.
So when I started deadlifting again, work capacity is super low, so there's no accessories or really anything like that. And my hamstrings were undertrained, and my hinge work was basically one set of deadlifts, and even at that, they were pretty easy sets because I was, gradual exposure therapy, kind of just working the weights back up slowly over time. And when the weight got heavy enough, like if you think about what's happening in the deadlift, if you do an easy rep in the deadlift, your hamstrings just aren't that involved, because they don't need to be. The hamstrings are biarticular, and your body tends not to call hamstrings in for a hip extension until the hip extension demands are substantial. So if it's an easy rep of deadlifts, then the hamstrings, I mean, they're there, but they're not like really cranking. So when I was actually starting to get better and think like, okay, maybe it's time for me to get back on the platform. Maybe I should start pulling heavy again. Still very little work. I did have a couple minor, I was lucky that they were minor hamstring tweaks, because basically it gets heavy enough and like you've got a back and quads and glutes that have all been trained, but then hamstrings have basically received very, very little stimulus for a long time. They're just not prepared for that. And if I could go back and do it again, like, yeah, absolutely should have done direct hamstring work to compensate for that. But I wasn't thinking about it like that at the time. So there's always these little edge cases to work through.
Yeah, that was pretty much my exact case where I was training the deadlift much higher intensities, went to a very sub-max setup, and then didn't really have a ton of exposure to the top end, not doing any hamstring work outside of it, just pulling. And I was like sick, slept really bad that night, had a scheduled max, was like, we're going for it anyway. But yeah, I'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, this is the same thing you see. It's less injurious, I guess, but it's the same thing that you see with the bench press. When people start out in lifting, they're always weakest off the chest. But you take anybody who's like a trained powerlifter or seasoned competitor, chances are they're not weak off the chest anymore. They're weak at the transition or maybe at the lockout or somewhere else, And if you think about it, they probably do tons and tons and tons and tons of bench work, and especially if the bench work is sub-max, you still get a strong contraction off the bottom. You get a strong contraction at the chest, but it's less strong for the lockout, the triceps. So I think just in general, the triceps end up being chronically undertrained, which is also why you tend to see powerlifting coaches favor tricep accessory work a lot, because triceps are generally undertrained by just doing bench or close grip bench and things like that. You've got to try pretty hard to bias a bench press enough toward triceps, like probably you're doing a very close grip and throw a mini band on there and it gets pretty close. But I would say even it's a good reason to include partials and things like that, floor press and board press and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I found that myself a ton. I remember like hearing about that when I was much younger, but I was like, nah, that's not a thing. And like if I just look back when I was benching, 135, 225, my sticking point was like basically at my chest, maybe tiny bit off. And then like benching 350-ish, it was like 3 inches off my chest. And now that I mentioned like 5, it's like getting pretty close to lockout, not quite lockout, like 2/3, 3/4 the way up. Got a lot of speed off the chest and kind of sticks. So that's definitely, like you said, a really good use for the variations, because triceps are going to lag a ton if you're a max grip bencher that never trains them.
I remember Dave Tate saying something about this when I was like coming up in the sport. Like he ran the Elite FTS Q&A, and people would ask all the time about like, how do you develop like a bench that's weak off the bottom? And that was a lot of what he said, is like, you just got to give it time. Just keep benching, keep pressing, and bench press itself trains the bottom end quite a bit. Like for that one, maybe you don't need as much like special exercises and stuff like that to like train the weakness. The bench itself does a pretty good job. The problem is it takes time for that to develop. I mean, that a lot of people in that situation are looking for something to do, and I think there are some things that you can do that'll kind of bias the program a little bit. But yeah, like bench and deadlift in particular are these 2-part movements. Squat seems to be like just more or less one motion. The bar path is straight, but in the bench press it's not. In the deadlift, the bar path is straight, but like the joint contractions are not synchronous. So bench and deadlift look like 2-part movements, and I think that makes it so that like one part or the other can be underdeveloped by just training the competition exercise.
Yeah, there's like an idea, I'm sure you've heard it, that like there's not a need for variations because the comp lift trains your weakness in the exact spot that it needs to be trained in. But like something on like a bench, where if you're benching with a max grip and you're pretty much maximally training your pecs, like if you do extra pec work, like you're not going to recover from it based off like the current program. Like that, over time, that might help your sticking point at the bottom. Or maybe you work on some technique or some other variations that help as well. But like a lot of it's just like a muscle mass component that just takes years to build potentially. But like if your triceps aren't super strong, which is maybe why you're using that max grip to begin with, it's kind of avoiding training your triceps, and you can handle a ton of extra tricep work on top of it. And so if you're just not doing that, or maybe you work on not just push downs, maybe some closer grip, stuff like that, then you're just kind of neglecting it. I think that's really common, that people get a little too hyper specific. And then like I've been in this case where I just started overhead pressing because I haven't really done like any overhead press in years. I'm like, I overhead press like 40% of my bench. I should probably just out of self-respect get that up to like 60%.
Man, that's, I mean, you touched on something there. The logic sounds good. And I mean, I've even said this at different times as well. Like the idea that training the specific movement trains your weakness in exactly the way that it needs to be trained. Like, yeah, in a way it does, or it can, but it doesn't have to, and this is what we were talking about, like the intensity differences before. So will training the competition bench train your triceps? Yeah, if it's heavy enough. The next question is, do you want your competition bench training to be that heavy to get a good tricep stimulus from it? What other downstream effects is that going to have? If your triceps aren't really being adequately challenged in the bench until you get to like a 9 RPE, which is going to be the truth for a lot of developed benchers, what other impacts is that going to have? Like, are we talking about lower intensity and you're doing like sets of 12 at like a 9 RPE, in which case you're still only getting like a couple reps that are good tricep stimulating reps? Or, we're going a lot heavier than that, which now the intensity of the program is just way heavier, or you could solve this a different way. You could use developmental exercises or preparatory exercises to get a tricep stimulus while also doing something else for the competition exercise that solves a different problem or works on a different aspect of your development. You just have a lot more degrees of freedom that way. And the deadlift, I think, is going to see similar things. Like you see this a lot with people who, imagine like you've got a conventional puller who likes to pull with a fairly rounded back. Well, you'll see a lot of times those people tend to be strong off the floor and they struggle with lockouts. So if we're doing low RPE deadlifts, they're going to generate so much speed off the floor that they more or less coast through the lockout. Are you going to tell me that you want that person to be deadlifting pretty high intensity, pretty high RPE almost all the time so that they're getting that stimulus on spinal extension? Or would you rather them do an accessory movement? I mean, by all means, use a variety of strategies. This is my coaching bias coming back into play here, but like, I think you should use a variety of strategies. If you're in a hypertrophy block, maybe you keep the comp lift toned down a little bit and you're just kind of doing, think of it more like technical practice, and you do accessory work that trains the muscles. And then at other stages of the program, maybe, yeah, you are doing very heavy sets of 5 to get that specific stimulus, training it exactly the way that it needs to be trained. Yeah, that's great to do. I just wouldn't want all of my training all the time to be that,
Yeah, I think this is kind of a side note, but I was super excited for this podcast because like I was correct. You're like someone that like really thinks about these things deeply, and like I am too. And sometimes, I don't know if you relate to this, I'm like so like almost sometimes stuff that like this stuff matters, don't get me wrong. Like sometimes stuff that just really has no practical application for me at all. But I'm just like, I have this question about training, and I'll just like think about it for like heck years trying to figure it out, even if it doesn't matter. It just like bothers me that I don't know the answer. Do you ever do that where you're thinking about like, this really doesn't matter a ton, but like it's just killing me?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how often I can accept the idea that it maybe doesn't matter a ton. But I mean, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, I mean, I still do think that over a long training career, and if you're trying to really push the envelope as far as you can, like if I could set a 2.5 kilo PR total, I would be fucking thrilled at this point, and like I've been doing this for such a long time, and if there's something that made like like 0.5% of difference, like even less than that. If you were going to tell me, make sure to drink your protein shake like immediately after the training session, like, yeah, anabolic window thing, that's kind of a myth, but if you drink it like immediately after, you won't notice any effects at all for like 5 years. But then at the end of 5 years, you'll set a 2.5 kilo PR. I'm in, like I'm in for
Me
that.
too.
So like this is a thing that I ask other coaches sometimes is like, it takes something like that, some trivial thing like this, that's like edge case, and it's not going to make a difference except a tiny little difference that's like years from now. Is that a thing that you will do? Does that mean hell yeah, I'm in? Or does that mean great, I don't have to worry about that? Because they're like, both are valid responses, I think. But like for me, I'm doing it, But lots of other coaches are like, well, if it's only going to be 2.5 kilos after 5 years, I ain't drinking that fucking protein shake.
No, I'm the same way as you. Like, my wife is asleep in the bedroom where I'd go in there. I have like 2 layers of blackout curtains, and they're not just like black, like they're drilled into the wall, like every couple inches. So there is zero light that gets in. Like, if there's any way to optimize anything, like we got curtains over our outside doors too. It's like not too much light's coming out under the door. Like, if there's any way to optimize something, like I'm doing it. So I'm the same way as you. But let me give you an example, because I think the details matter a ton. But I was like, the examples of like, I'm not sure if this really matters. So whenever I would just coach myself, I wouldn't have any athletes, and I was having successful training. So I was like, there's no way I'm going to change this up. I'll have the best training ever. But I just have like random thoughts that are difficult to answer. Unless maybe like you're working with more athletes and you can like actually see these things. I'd be like, okay, if I do a set of 5 with a 10 rep max, that is a set of 5 at RPE 5, versus if I do a single with a 2 rep max, a single at RPE 9. And I was like, I don't think those sets are quite the same thing. Like, trying to quantify volume. This is a thing I had like years ago. And I was like, well, like if I do 2 sets of 5 at RPE 5, is that the same? Like, maybe not the exact same. You see what I'm trying to say? Is like 2
right. Yeah.
9.
Oh, for sure. But that one I think is quite consequential, though.
No, I agree. But I was saying like it was a thing that in my current training, I was like, this is not relevant to my current training. I'm making really good progress, so I can't really like find the answer. And then eventually, like, you work with athletes, you're like, okay, like I think the RPE matters a little bit more than like doing a set of 20 with the 40 rep max isn't going to be as stimulative or fatiguing likely as like a single at 9. But it was just like this idea that I'd like play with in my mind, and I was like, just genuinely for like probably a year, I was like, I think I have this idea, but like I can't test it. So I need to get this idea out of my mind, because like in this current moment, like I'm not training on, I'm just coaching myself. I have an idea, but like I can't really test it. And then like eventually you test it and it's like pretty easy to solve. And it's like, okay, like RPE probably matters a lot more. But like in the moment, I was like, this is just not important to me. Just like get this thought out of here. But it bugged me for years. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like I wrestled with very similar things, right? Like the similar ideas even. Like, what's the difference between, one set of 10 with a 10 rep max versus 2 sets of 5 with a 10 rep max, which is the same volume, but the experience under the bar is pretty drastically different. The effects are different, so like, how do you, like, this is like a classic powerlifter kind of question, I think, is like, how many sets and reps do I do? Which is a question everybody has, and there just weren't any good answers. Like, there were programs for sure, like, and that's been the case forever, but people would ask that question, and it's just a people would say it's a bad question, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad question. It's just a very difficult question to answer. But I've put a lot of work into answering that question. How many sets and reps do I do? And I mean, it's a long answer, but and it's different for everybody. And there's a lot of, nuance and rabbit holes to go down. But like, that's essentially what you're trying to do when you're writing all these different programs, is answer that question.
Yeah, I don't think I explained that very well, but you explained it better than me. Like, I was thinking like if I'm doing a 1 rep max, because I was training like that more like a bodybuilder style at the time. I was like, a 1 rep max seems to be a lot more comparable to a 5 rep max than like 8 sets of 5, which max is compared to one with a 3 rep max.
So this is like a whole line of reasoning that led down like the early stages of stress index development. Again, like this is kind of a system of quantifying the stimulus and the difficulty of recovering from a given training protocol. You could do 5 sets of 5, and how does that compare to 4 sets of 6? Because it's practically the same in terms of total reps. Well, what RPE are we talking about? There's different rabbit holes that we can go down there, but like trying to answer that question, like I used a very similar line of reasoning, and came to sounds like similar conclusions to what you came to. And it's like the RPE matters, the working set matters, the reps matter a little bit, the intensity matters a little bit, but the biggest drivers are like number of sets at what RPEs. And over time, it's gotten a lot more nuanced and detailed, and we use the training log to do all the calculations in the background now. But like try to you think of these different edge cases. What about a myo-rep series? So maybe your first set is like 12 reps at a 10, but then like your second set is like 3 reps at a 10 with the same weight. Like how is that different from the first set? And like trying to wrap your head around stuff like that. And I think we can do a pretty good job of it now, but there's of course always details and nuances and individualization things that you could maybe squeeze a few more drops of blood from the turnip.
Yeah, that reminds me of like the scientific kind of lens and question I was asking earlier, where like you've heard of the like 5 rep, can't think of the name. It's like 5 reps from
effective reps
model. Yeah. This is like an example too of me being like, this is important stuff, but like at a certain point, like I'm like hyper analyzing stuff so much where like I'll do like a 10 rep max and on like a push down, and then my next set like I'll do like only like 5 reps, and they're both to failure, and I'll just get so deep in thought. And I think that stuff's super important and like literally my favorite thing to think about in the world. That's why I have a podcast. But like I just lost, like I'm doing 5 reps still, but like in theory I'm fatigued enough where I'm not getting any of the like effective reps from the first set, because I really just did reps 1 through 5 instead of reps 6 through 10. And then you start like thinking about things differently. And that's why I think like your model, instead of just going off of only RPE or only effective reps, but like what do you call it? The stress
index.
Stress index, I think, is really, really smart.
Thank you. Yeah, it helps clarify a lot of things. I think, that even like the effective reps model, I think has been criticized a little bit and there's nuances on like why you might want to criticize it, and that's fine. But it does seem to be like a generally helpful way to think about things.
I agree.
Yeah, so you can definitely start there, but like imagining your set of 10 tricep pushdowns, those first 5 reps don't count as 0. They're maybe comparatively less effective, but they're not 0 effective, and they're not 0 recovery cost either. So there's something there, and I think it's worth thinking about that as well. Like where you'll see it more often, like be relevant. Well, I'm trying to think about like how to talk about this without needing to go into too much detail on stress index, because it can be more math than is great for a podcast, I think. But like stress index can break into 2 subcomponents. We'll call it central stress and peripheral stress. Think of central stress as like your more intensity driven stress, not central nervous system, but central is, and like the effects tend to be more centrally felt. You do a very high intensity training session, lots of very high intensity sets. The next day, like you feel like the brain fog and grogginess and things like that, right? Whereas you do a very rep based workout, the next day you're probably feeling sore in like peripherally, so central stress, peripheral stress. That's one way to think of it. And the total stress is kind of those two numbers combined, and that's more like the overall recovery cost of a given protocol. So by kind of looking at the central and peripheral stress numbers, we can get a good sense of which systems are being affected, what are the primary training effects of a given protocol. So it's pretty common to give an athlete, let's say squat 75% for sets of 5, multiple sets of 5. Now, for most people, 75% for 5 reps is going to be like 5 reps in reserve, maybe more, So it's going to be pretty low RPE work. You will get a different training effect doing like multiple sets of 5 at 75% versus a fewer number sets of 10 at 75%. And you can model that in the stress index numbers. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not, the stress index isn't determining the training effect. It's just describing what was already there.
Yeah, how much of the stress index was like a top-down thing, like I have this theory and put it into practice in the stress index, versus how much of it is like noticing trends in athletes that kind of refines it?
I'd say it's a decent mix at this point. So I started my work developing stress index, gosh, it might have been like 2014 or 2015. It was a long time ago. And my initial attempts were fairly crude, let's say. But it was describing this underlying relationship. And it was based on my coaching experience and training experience. And then we would analyze training logs and try to tweak it and refine it from there. And it ended up being like this series of coefficients where, a set at 10 RPE counted for this many points. A set at 9 RPE counted for that many points. And, you would add up your number of points. And around that same time, I didn't know who Robert Frederick was at the time, but he was like noticed the same problem and was kind of working on his solution on his own. And then at some point, I forget how exactly, we got introduced to each other and kind of find out we'd both been working on this independently and came up with pretty different solutions. His solution was a lot more rep based, and there's articles written on it. He calls it exertion load. So if anybody's interested, you just Google exertion load and it'll come up pretty readily. And like the blog posts are still there, and he goes through details on like how he came up with it, and like what it's based off of, what it relates to, and there's good detail there. If you mapped the stress index that I developed with the exertion load that he developed, the numbers, of course, are different, but they are modeling the same relationship. Like the shape of the curve is the same, And I thought that was really cool that we're like independently coming up with similar solutions to this problem without talking to each other. But then I also noticed that like the way that he modeled it, by modeling kind of the stress per repetition and adding all those together instead of like the stress per set, you can get more detailed and like break down those numbers a little bit differently. That's what allows you to break it down into central and peripheral factors and stuff like that. So I borrowed some of the ideas that he presents in exertion load, and I kind of merged them with some of the stress index ideas as well. I liked the scaling that I was on. Like the exertion load numbers will, I hope I'm not totally incorrect here, but they would be numbers in like the thousands. So like they're more similar to like tonnage numbers and stuff like that, and they don't relate to anything else that, so so my exertion load was 4,000. I think that's a valid exertion load, but you get the idea. And I don't know what that means unless I'm like super familiar with exertion load, where stress index, I could say my stress index was 4, and you can think of it like number of hard sets. And now, even if you're not super familiar with stress index, I know what 4 sets feels like. Like it's for me as a coach, it was easier to wrap my head around. So I kind of merged these ideas, and that's a lot of where stress index came from. And we like continued to tweak and refine it, like I was mentioning, to deal with some of those edge cases like myo reps, and like I make some other decisions as well, just based on use case. Like I think Robert, at least at the time, the last time I looked at it, he used absolute load in his calculation. So if you squat 300 kilos and your work sets were at 250, he would put 250 in the equation, where I would put like a relative number, whatever 250 as a percentage of 300 is. Like I would include the percentage, where he would include like the absolute number. And that's like, I made that choice because I want the number to be comparable across exercises as well. Mm-hmm. So if you do leg press, or if you do plat squats, or you do split squats, I want the number to still matter, whereas if you're using an absolute load, it's just going to be different, and you can't compare it unless it's the same exercise. So there's a few tweaks like that, and a few differences just based on like, how are you going to use this, that the math is going to work out differently.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've kind of thought about trying to do something like that on my own. I've had like the ideas, and you're saying like the curves and all. I'm like imagining like, yeah, I've kind of had similar thoughts, but I feel like it's such a cool concept. I can see why it took you so long, because like there's so much that goes into it.
Yeah.
You're saying like, then like it's gonna look a little different on like Jesus than
right.
Like it's gonna look so much different, because even just like a thought I've had is like, at a certain, I have kind of like 2 ideas on this, but like at a certain point, some athletes get so strong and they can handle so little because of that I almost think like lower RPEs, while like in theory maybe shouldn't work as well, they almost work better, because if Jesus is doing AMRAPs on squat, he can handle like 1, like maybe 2 a week potentially, and so like each set is just so much more stimulating that like an 80% single is likely also more stimulating for him, I would imagine. Or potentially like there's just some bottleneck of maybe it's actually not more stimulating, and like his cap is like the workload that he needs to progress is slowly getting closer to the amount of workload he can recover from, and then they just like kind of swap, so he can't do enough workload to progress at some point potentially. But I don't know. I think about these things a lot. I'll have to look into the stress index more.
Sure. Yeah. That would be one thing that I think this is like a common powerlifting coaching belief that I think I probably cut the other way on, is that, strong people incur like more training stress, more stimulus per rep. Mm-hmm. And this could be like a semantic thing, but I think it's either not true or it doesn't matter. It's one of those 2 things. And I'm not sure exactly which, but in either case, it tends to be a thing that I can disregard. Like if I'm working with somebody, they're super strong, their work capacity is whatever their work capacity is, and I don't have to worry about, is 80% super stimulating for them or not, because 80% is going to be stimulating relative to 90% or 70% in a similar way as it would be for somebody who is less strong. Maybe somebody who's less strong does have a higher work capacity, and that's okay too. But I don't find myself thinking those thoughts very often, like, oh, so and so is very strong, so we have to uh, pull the training load down. You know,
Mhm.
I tend to think like their training load is what they can recover from and adapt to. It is whatever it is, and I don't have to get overly concerned. Like if somebody squats 200 and this other person squats 300, does that make a big difference in terms of how much can they recover from? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if I'm comparing their numbers to their own numbers in terms of training workload, then it's a apples to apples anyway, and I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. The only thing differently, I guess, that I've thought about it with is like if I had an athlete like so incredibly strong that they just really couldn't do much. Like they're like it's like Eddie Hall pulling 500 kilos, and he used to pull like every other week or something. Like I know like Half Thor does things similar. Like would it be intelligent of me to try to like somewhat change the programming approach to be a little bit more submax because like maybe they feel like their technique is lacking because they can only pull heavy every other week. But then I also don't coach anyone like this. And I think those are like answers that would be like fairly easy to solve if like I was. And like maybe that's not wise. Maybe like there's a reason that Half Thor pulls heavy every other week and like Eddie did the same thing, you know? So maybe those answers aren't as difficult to solve as I would think. But
Yeah, I mean it's a good idea to start by assuming that there's good reasons for this, right? Like whatever those tendencies, I wouldn't. I think it's a lot of hubris to look at some of the strongest people in the world and be like, "Ah, they'd be so much better if they just listen to me." You know, this
yeah.
is but I mean, there is some of that. There has to be. This is what we were talking about earlier. Like you are making some sort of prediction, and if you can't help, then what are you doing here? You know, so you do have to have something to bring to that coaching relationship. Um, but I would still look at it like, well, there's probably a good reason why they've evolved to this solution. And if I want to change it, that's fine, but maybe we'll change it cautiously, you know. And in the case of like let's say you take one of these mega deadlifters that tend to deadlift heavy every other week. Um, they also tend to be gigantic with, I mean, I don't know about Thor, um, but Eddie Hall in his peak was not an aerobic specimen. You know, and you see that as well, right? Like especially with gigantic dudes, they're out of breath all the time. You know, so that definitely has an impact on recovery. And so, yeah, maybe it's just like a work capacity thing in that sense. Like, yeah, if they're going to deadlift heavy, like to put some stress index terms on it, maybe their deadlift work capacity is like 3 per week, and you're going to have that heavy deadlift session and it's going to be 5 just by itself. So maybe, yeah, you do a heavy deadlift session, but you got to sandbag the rest of it for a little while to give them time to recover, you know. Or you could take it like a more middle of the road approach and maybe they can recover, but then there's additional trade-offs that you're making. I think like stress index is probably a good lens to look at it through because it'll help you understand how much work are they able to recover from and how much work are you giving them. And then you're looking at kind of the contents of that work. Does this solve the problem that I'm trying to solve? Is this stimulating the spinal extension thing that I'm talking about? Because also these big dudes pulling conventional like that do tend to be lockout limited, spinal extension limited. So if you want the deadlift work itself to be stimulating for that, it does need to be pretty heavy. So if we've got a low work capacity and we're going to want to deadlift heavy so that we get that stimulus, then we're going to have to space it out. You could take a more middle of the road approach, but now we've got this gap where we're not getting the spinal extension stimulus that maybe we wanted, and we've got to find a different way to get that. And, does I'm kind of telling the story as if like Half Thor's got a super low deadlift work capacity, but like as a strongman, that's most of what you do. So it's probably not exactly the case, but how does that fit with the rest of his training and the rest of his program as well?
Yeah. What you're saying though seems like pretty accurate with what they're doing, because he'll take like I believe that he was the same. I could be wrong, but Half Thor does like heavy and light weeks, and so he'll get that like really heavy touch, and he needs those spinal erector demands by going heavier. And then the next week, I mean, it's still like 350 kilos. I mean, it's still pretty
Right,
heavy, but like he'll do a lighter week and still get in like a lighter touch and get some technique and all that,
right.
but not just completely taken off 2 weeks.
Yeah. Keep familiar with the movement and everything.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
This is like a longer podcast compared to what I normally do, but I had like a ton of fun. I still have like a ton of questions, and I'm very interested. We have a lot of topics I feel like we didn't quite finish, so I'd love to have you on another time, maybe after a while.
Sure.
But I really appreciate you coming on. I don't want to take up your whole day or anything. If honestly, I'd potentially try to take up your whole day if I didn't have stuff. I just see it. Like,
No,
we'll see when you just.
it's super fun. I love talking training and comparing notes like this. This is my idea of a good time. Sorry, I'm monologuing so much we couldn't get through to all the questions, but I'd love to.
Oh no, this was much
chat again.
preferred. I went off topic a lot too. I was monologuing as well. I think it was more interesting. We got through like almost all the questions I had. It's just we also added in a lot more questions, so there's no issue with monologuing at all.
Good.
But do you want to like tell people where they can find you or anything?
Sure. I mean, I'm posting on Instagram quite a bit lately, and that's really the main place. But then Reactive Training Systems is also on Instagram and YouTube. And then it's worth noting that we have a free training log app. It's at reactivetrainingsystems.com. And if you log in and click on apps, you're pretty much there. And it's a free training log. You can log your training. It'll calculate all this stuff, the stress index, the central, the peripheral, calculates all that stuff for you. So you get a better sense over time of where maybe your work capacity is at and what do you want to do with that. And you can run reports on your training log, block reviews. You can run meta block reviews. We've got tons of tools that are designed for powerlifters, designed for powerlifting coaches, designed to help you understand the training log and ultimately to make better training decisions as a result. We want to get to the point where the training blocks that we're writing are optimized for the individual. It's obviously we're big on individualization, but having a process to get to that individual optimum is important. So the training log is designed to help you do that. So that's available for anybody who wants to log training. You just go to reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on apps and log your training.
Awesome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, happy to join you.